The year is 1484. A young woman named Agnes leapt in the village of Endor, Switzerland. She has just given birth to her second child and all seems well until the following morning when her husband discovers that she is missing. The villagers are baffled by her disappearance and rumors quickly spread that she must have run away. However, suspicion soon falls upon a man in town, a wandering healer named Thomas. Thomas had recently treated Agnes for a mysterious illness, and it was rumored that he had used witchcraft to cure her. This may sound like an odd accusation, but at the time, healing illnesses without the help of God was considered a form of witchcraft. And so Thomas is brought before the local magistrate, a man named Nicholas, and he denies any wrongdoing and even claims that he was Undeven in the village at the time of Agnes's disappearance. But this only makes him seem more guilty. After all, why would someone be so nervous if they weren't hiding something? Nicholas believes that Thomas is guilty and wants to punish him harshly, so he has him stripped naked and tortured. Thomas eventually confesses to everything Nicholas wants to hear, and names a few other supposed witches who he says have been conspiring against him. One of these supposed witches is a woman named Elsa, and though she too claims to be innocent, she is also tortured and forced to confess. The confessions of these two supposed witches leads to a total of 17 villagers being accused. They were all burned alive, including Elsa and Thomas, despite none of them actually being witches. This horrifying story is sadly just one of many from the early modern period, which saw millions of people across Europe accused of witchcraft. Most of those accused were women, and many were persecuted simply because men were scared of their freedom. To understand how we got here, let's travel back in time to the 15th century. For centuries, European men had lived under a strict social order that limited a woman's role to that of a subservient wife and mother. Women could not own property in their own name and were largely dependent on men for economic support. The dominant ideology was that a woman's place was in the home raising children and tending to household duties. Men enforced this social order through violence and control, and women were expected to submit to male authority. However, as the Renaissance began, things started to change. More opportunities became available for women outside the home, and some even began to seek higher education. Though still rare, educated women were challenging traditional gender roles and gaining recognition for their intellect. Perhaps most threateningly of all, wealthy women no longer had to rely on men for economic support. In fact, they had enough money to support themselves and often employed their own servants. This challenged the traditional power dynamic between men and women and threatened the social order that men had maintained for so long. Men were deeply unsettled by this, and as a result, began to construct a narrative that demonized women and portrayed them as inherently dangerous to society. Women were seen as a threat to the patriarchal system and as a result, began to be targeted. To better understand how this narrative gained traction, let's take a look at a popular male fantasy of the time. The femme fatale is a common character archetype found in literature, film and folklore that depicts a woman who uses her sexuality to manipulate and entrap men. She is typically portrayed as a dangerous and unpredictable seductress, who is ultimately responsible for her lover's downfall. While the origins of the trope are difficult to pinpoint, it appears frequently during the Renaissance and is often used to explain the downfall of famous men. For example, in Shakespeare's play of The Femme Fatale is the character Lady Macbeth, who manipulates her husband into killing the king. Then there is the legend of Macbeth, who is tricked by 3 witches into murdering King Duncan, allowing Macbeth to seize the throne. In both of these cases, the stories serve to warn men of the dangers of female manipulation. However, the most compelling examples of the femme fatale can be found in the folklore of the time, where stories were used to shape people's beliefs about the world around them. Take, for example, the story of Cinderella. At first glance, this may seem like a harmless fairy tale about a young woman who attends the emperor's ball and meets a prince. However, a closer look reveals a much darker narrative. Cinderella is mistreated by her stepmother and stepsisters, who represent the dangers of female jealousy and resentment. Furthermore, Cinderella's transformation at the ball represents her ability to deceive and manipulate the prince into marrying her. Ultimately, the story serves as a warning to young men about the deceptive nature of women. In another story, that of Snow White, the evil queen represents the ultimate femme fatale. She is driven by vanity and jealousy and murders Snow White out of fear that she is more beautiful. Even the magic mirror that the queen consults is a symbol of female manipulation, as it only serves to reinforce the queen's vanity and ultimately leads to her downfall. These stories, and countless others like them, were used to warn men of the dangers of female manipulation, and to reinforce traditional gender roles. But as women became freer and more independent, men needed new ways to exert control over them. Enter witchcraft. Though accusations of witchcraft had been common throughout history, they really took off during the early modern period, particularly in areas where women were becoming more independent and challenging traditional gender roles. In these communities, women were accused of using witchcraft to gain power and control over men. The image of the cunning, manipulative, which was consistent with the growing fear of female independence, and served as a way to control women's behavior. By accusing women of witchcraft, men could maintain their dominance and ensure that women would continue to conform to traditional gender roles. And while men were scared of any independent woman, there was one type that they feared more than any other: the sexually liberated woman. If a woman was accused of sleeping around, then she was not only a threat to the religious and moral order, she was also seen as a potential threat to the social order, since promiscuity could lead to questions surrounding the legitimacy of children and heirs. Such women were often marginalized and ostracized by society, and in some cases, accused of witchcraft. This was especially true in areas where traditional gender roles were being challenged, and women were seeking greater freedom and autonomy. So let's return to our story from the beginning. When Agnes disappeared, it didn't take long for people to start blaming Elslat Thomas. She was a healer, which alone made her suspicious, and like many independent women, she was seen as a threat to the traditional gender roles. When her house was searched, people found a number of items that confirmed their suspicions. These included books on medicine, as well as herbs and ointment, which was seen as evidence of her alleged witchcraft. Given that she was already seen as a potential threat, it didn't take much to convince people that she was behind Agnes's disappearance. And after she confessed, it was easy for the authorities to use her as a scapegoat to crack down on other independent women in the area. Though it's important to note that the vast majority of people accused of witchcraft were completely innocent. The accusations often stemmed from deeply ingrained fears of female independence and challenges to traditional gender roles. Men were afraid of women who did not conform to societal expectations, and used witchcraft accusations as a means to maintain control and dominance. Sadly, this persecution of innocent people continued throughout Europe for decades. Eventually, however, things began to change as Enlightenment thinkers started to challenge traditional beliefs and superstitions. The persecution of witches gradually declined, though it wasn't until the 1950s that the last official witch trials ended. Today, we recognize that the persecution of witches was a dark chapter in human history, and we remember those who were accused and suffered because of these baseless claims. Moreover, we should acknowledge the role that fear of female independence and challenges to traditional gender roles played in fueling the witch craze, and understand how these fears can manifest in other contexts today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks for watching.